In 2024, the average 25-year-old from Gen Z held 3.2 active income streams. When millennials were that same age, that number was 1.1. That's not a statistic about hustle culture or ambition. That's a complete rewiring of how an entire generation thinks about money, time, and what a career is even supposed to be. I want to tell you what actually changed. Not the surface noise a euro, not the TikTok side hustle advice or the stop buying lattes nonsense. The deep structural shift in how a generation decided to build wealth. Because millennials didn't fail. They played the game they were handed, played it honestly, and by every traditional measure, many of them did everything right. Gen Z just looked at that same table and refused to sit down. To understand why, you have to go back to 2008. Millennials graduated into the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. The class of 2008 entered a job market that had just been vaporized. Average student loan debt had crossed $28,000. Unemployment hit 10%. And the promise a euro, the foundational promise that had driven every millennial's upbringing a euro, was that if you got the degree, got the job, put in the years, and climbed the corporate ladder, security would come. A pension, a 401k, a house in the suburbs, maybe early retirement if you were disciplined enough. Millions of millennials did exactly what they were told. They showed up, worked the 60-hour weeks, and waited. But the ladder had already lost its rungs. Home prices appreciated 118% between 2010 and 2020. Wages grew 33% in that same decade. The math stopped working. And millennials a euros, many still carrying student debt like a stone around their neck a euros, watched the wealth gap widen in real time, year after year. They weren't doing anything wrong. The rules had quietly changed without anyone sending a memo. Gen Z watched all of this happen. They were teenagers while millennials were struggling, and they took notes. What they observed wasn't failure, it was a warning, and that warning shaped everything that came after. By the time Gen Z entered the workforce in meaningful numbers a euros, 2019-2020 a euros, something else had already occurred that nobody was paying enough attention to. The internet had fully matured. The creator economy crossed $100 billion in annual revenue. YouTube, Shopify, Etsy, TikTok a euro, these were no longer fringe tools, they were legitimate wealth-building infrastructure. Accessible to anyone with a phone and a skill, and Gen Z didn't just use that infrastructure, they built empires on it. Consider the numbers. A 2023 Bank of America survey found that 38% of Gen Z adults described their primary wealth strategy as entrepreneurial a euros, either running a business or monetizing a personal brand. For millennials at that same age, the number was 11%. These aren't side gigs. These are primary financial architectures built by people in their early 20s. And then there's investing. The average millennial opened a brokerage account at 27. The average Gen Z investor opened one at 21. But more importantly, they arrived already knowing what index funds were. They grew up with Vanguard and Fidelity as household names. The financial literacy gap that blindsided so many millennials a euros. The one where nobody explained compound interest or tax-advantaged accounts until it was almost too late a euros. Gen Z largely closed on their own through Reddit threads, YouTube channels, and financial podcasts their parents had never heard of. But wait, because this next piece is where it gets interesting. House hacking became a genuine Gen Z playbook. While millennials were told homeownership meant buying the house where you raise your family, a wave of Gen Z buyers in their early 20s began purchasing multi-family properties, living in one unit and renting out the others, not as some landlord fantasy, as a calculated first move. Some of these buyers haven't paid a mortgage out of pocket since the day they closed, because their tenants cover it entirely. They own an asset, they live for free, and they're 24 years old. But here's the single thing that separates this generation most profoundly from the one before it. It is not the investing strategy, the side income, or even the real estate play. It is the time mindset. Millennials were sold time as a currency you traded for stability. You gave the company your best years, and they gave you a paycheck and a sense of security. Gen Z entered the workforce already suspicious of that arrangement. And then the pandemic a euro, which many of them experienced as students or early career workers a euro, blew the contract up entirely. Offices shuttered, remote work became normal, and an entire generation realized almost overnight that the physical commute and the rigid 9-to-5 structure wasn't a fundamental requirement of work. It was a feature, one that could be removed, so they removed it. Freelance platforms reported that Gen Z made up 47% of new freelancers in 2022, compared to just 18% in 2017. That is not a gig economy trend. That is an identity shift. For a growing number of Gen Z workers, the question isn't how do I find a good job? The question is how do I build something where I own my own time? And here is where the math becomes extraordinary. A millennial who earns $65,000 at 25 and maxes out a 401k with real discipline could accumulate around $2.1 million by 65. That is a genuinely excellent outcome. That is financial security built through patience and consistency. But a Gen Z entrepreneur who earns $65, seals in at 25 across 2 income streams, reinvests into a third, builds a small e-commerce store to $8,000 a month by 30, and then moves that cash into rental property? The ceiling becomes nearly impossible to calculate because the game they are playing has no fixed endpoint. The compounding isn't just financial. It's architectural. Here is the truth that this entire comparison has been building toward. Gen Z is not building wealth differently because they are smarter. They are not more talented or more ambitious than the millennials who came before them. They are doing it differently because the old model cracked wide open just as they were arriving, and they had no choice but to rebuild using different materials. The internet gave them infrastructure. The pandemic gave them permission to question everything traditional. And watching millennials struggle gave them the motivation to ask harder questions before accepting the default answers. What they built in response is something genuinely new. A wealth philosophy that centers on multiple income streams, digital assets, time sovereignty, and financial literacy absorbed before the first paycheck. Not learned after 40 when course correction is harder. Not picked up at a seminar. Built from scratch as teenagers because the world they were entering demanded it. The millennial story is not a failure story. It is a story about playing the hand you were dealt with the information you had. And the Gen Z story is not a success story yet. It is still unfolding. Most of this generation is still under 30. The real test of whether this architectural difference translates into genuine, lasting wealth will take another decade to know. But the shift is real. And we are only beginning to understand its scale. If you are watching this from somewhere in between a millennial who never received the guidance you deserved, or a Gen Z who is still figuring out where to begin the strategies exist. The infrastructure is real. The only thing that changes is the question you decide to ask, not how do I get a better job, but what does building wealth on my own terms actually look like? That question, once you ask it honestly, tends to change the answer to everything that comes after.